Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, February 2nd. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 212 days, the game against Michigan in 296 days. We had a chance to sort of kickstart the 2023 football season on Wednesday with a long series of interviews with Ryan Day, 10 of his on-field assistants, plus Mark Pantoni, plus James Laurinaitis. There was a lot of football talk on Wednesday. If you want to hear an hour of conversation about that, Tony Gerdeman and I dropped a new episode of the Buckeye Weekly podcast on Wednesday afternoon, talking about sort of a position-by-position group look at all the position groups around the field, as well as some guys who are going to be missing this spring. So you can find that at the Buckeye Weekly podcast feed. But today we're going to be talking to Kevin Noon about some other stuff that we learned and we heard during those interviews. Kevin, I guess let's start with one of the big stories, and there were several kind of big storylines that we ran through during the course of those few hours inside the Woody Hayes. But I think the first one that a lot of people are going to be interested in is Ryan Day giving up play calling. That was something that Kirk Herbstreit had kind of reported that Day had sort of mentioned that around the time of the Peach Bowl, and it sounds like Day really is thinking about making that kind of a real switch.
Yeah, and it'll all start here with the spring and kind of see what happens there. I don't want to necessarily say a trial run, because a trial run makes it sound like there's no going back. But I guess if it goes horribly, then there is going back. But yeah, let Brian Hartline and some of these other coaches have a little bit more of a hand in the play calling as they go through spring. Not to get ahead of ourselves, they'll be without several key components during the spring, but that doesn't change the fact that you have 15 practices to go through and a lot of work that needs to be gone through, especially with nearly a dozen incoming freshmen who are already on campus. And, this allows Ryan Day to be the head coach more of, he can be involved with all aspects. He can be more of the CEO, a little bit more involved with some of the culture of the team, things of those natures. So, I think it's very exciting. I was very intrigued by hearing Ryan Day's plan for it. I mean, it's still very much a work in progress, but, I think we'll get out of spring and probably have our spring postmortem meetings with the coaches and kind of get a little bit more of an idea of what they thought. But of course, we know what their usual response is. Got to check the film.
You always have to check the film. That is the number one rule of football and coaching and football coaching interviews. One thing that I did think that was interesting that Ryan Day talked about was why he's making that change and the point of the season when that's going to be the most important for him personally. And it was not at the beginning of the season. It was sort of kind of middle towards end of the season when you sort of get guys hitting the wall. The stress on the culture of your program is probably at its highest point. He said that's when he wants to maybe have more time to focus on the CEO type stuff and some of the bigger picture, overall program culture stuff. Mid to the end of the regular season is when that is maybe most important for him. So that's one of the key driving factors behind this potential move from Ryan Day away from play caller. So then the question is, okay, whether it's Ryan Day, whether it's Brian Hartline, whoever's calling those plays, who is going to be the quarterback taking the snaps to start executing those plays this fall? That is definitely going to be maybe the single biggest storyline all spring as they sort of try and get this sorted out. It's really, they have 4 quarterbacks on the roster this year. 3 of them will be in for the spring. Lincoln Keenholz will show up over the summer. But really, this is a Kyle McCord versus Devin Brown battle. And, what was interesting to me was it sounded like Ryan Day maybe wants to have this thing settled, if possible, earlier than we might have expected him to.
Yeah, exactly. We all have been saying, well, they'll let the starter know when they're getting off the bus in Bloomington for the season opener week 1. And, there's a lot of reasoning behind that. You keep everybody hopefully in town and involved. It'd be very difficult to do it with one of the 2 guys that's battling for the position, a true freshman in Lincoln Keenholz, and then transfer Tristan Gibbia, who's coming in from Oregon State. So if we do know at the end of spring, it'll be really interesting to see what kind of ripples that has. If Devin Brown gets it, does that force Kyle McCord to make a difficult decision? If Kyle McCord gets it, Devin Brown's a year younger. I mean, it could be just 1 year of Kyle McCord. I mean, how does that work? But, yeah, well, there are a lot of times we hear a lot of lip service, and that didn't really feel like we were getting lip service of saying, oh, we'd like to make the decision then. I mean, sure. Sure you would. And we'll find out still first week of September. But, he was saying the right things. It's an even quarterback battle. I mean, it's all, it all starts now. Nobody's carrying over any poker chips from the last game or anything else there. So, I guess we'll see. And when I say we'll see very limited in terms of what we get to see when spring practice ramps up. I'm sure that they will have the quarterbacks practicing like in Marion while we are on campus, so we will not get a chance to see much of that. But looking forward to it. It's certainly one of the off the field stories or on the field, just practice type of stories that we're going to be following closest going into spring, which is not that far away as I look, and we're in the first week of February.
Yeah, I think spring ball generally starts that first week of March, so I'm going to guess, I think they put out the schedule, but I think it was like the Tuesday, March 7th or thereabouts is going to be the start of spring ball, which, boy, we're only about a month away, which is crazy enough. And Brian Day talked about the fact that the two guys kind of had some different skill sets. Got a chance to talk to Corey Dennis. Corey Dennis talked about the fact that, maybe Devin Brown is a little bit more mobile than Kyle McCord in terms of extending plays with his legs and that kind of stuff. But both of those guys can do it. And it's really sort of degrees to one way or another in terms of what one guy might be a little bit better at than the other. And so, yes, that is potentially going to be decided potentially by the end of spring, and we have seen in the past quarterback battles where one of the quarterbacks who now plays for the Cincinnati Bengals basically said, like, you got to let me know because I got to make a decision after the spring. So we'll see, that's a possibility that one of those guys says that coming into the spring. So it sort of forces their hand to make that decision by the end of the spring. So we'll see how that goes. As Kevin said, probably not the last time we're going to be talking about quarterbacks on this show this year, this month, maybe this week. But the next thing we do need to talk about is the guys who will be protecting whoever that quarterback is, the offensive line. That feels like that's maybe the single biggest question mark on the team, because the two quarterbacks, you got a pair of 5-star quarterbacks coached by Ryan Day. Whoever it is, it'll be fine. Don't worry. The offensive line is a little bit more of a question mark because they lost Paris Johnson. They lost DeJuan Jones. Those are two guys that I think we were both expecting them to lose. They also lost Luke Whippler, and it sounded from talking to some of those guys like that was maybe a little bit more of a surprise to them, which left them with another hole to fill on that offensive line. And Ryan Day was asked about, how confident he is, how comfortable he is with the offensive line. It was kind of like, yeah, it's not bad right now. It's okay. It was not the, I don't think, Kevin, that they know for sure who they're going to have in just what spots yet. It's going to be sort of a spring to sort of mix and match and move guys around and try and figure out who fits where best.
Yeah, we always talk about getting the best 11 out there, and certainly with the line, getting the best 5 out there. And of course, you have to make sure that the positions fit. We can't just have 5 centers out there or 5 non-centers. Somebody's got to snap the ball. You gotta find the right combination. But we certainly have heard a lot of names of old faces potentially in new places of how that could shape up. I mean, obviously the Luke Whippler news kind of caught him off guard. They go to the portal. They bring in Vic Cutler. He's somebody who can play center. It sounds like Matt Jones, could end up still staying at guard. Taker Shabola is somebody that is mentioned about, sliding out to tackle. Carson Hinsman is somebody that had a pretty strong offseason so far. Zim Mikulski. There are a lot of names out there that are all going to be looked at very closely. Unfortunately, Jacob James is not going to be one that's going to get an opportunity for much in the spring because he's part of a list of players that are already kind of shut down for the demanding work of spring practice. We don't have a firm update on exactly what's going to be holding James out, but it's going to be such a critical practice period, especially as Ohio State has to try and maintain its 85, and you have to figure that come the end of spring, there might be a name or two that might see greener pastures elsewhere, and that's not trying to name anybody, but it is so important on the offensive line. And it would certainly suit Ohio State well to develop some depth because we're going to get to 24 and there are going to be some other names that are going to be out of there. Obviously, Cutler and Donovan Jackson would be through his third year. And Matt Jones would be gone. So then you'd be having to replace the interior line. So you got to keep this bus moving at all times, and it'll be exciting to see what happens there, and to see the different configurations that they have at the practices we get to see. And I'm sure that the internet will pour over, well, what does this mean? This group were the ones, this one, and there's 3 days later, this group were the ones. I mean, does that mean somebody has fallen off? No, I'm going to just say right now, here in early February, they're probably just going to try a lot of different looks and see what works. And sometimes you just have to throw a bunch of sticks up in the air and see which ones land the right way. And I think that might be what happens.
Yeah, the exact word he used was okay. He was asked how he felt about the offensive line and the offensive tackle position. The exact word was, quote, okay, which is not great. It's not terrible. He said, quote, I think we have a chance to have a good offensive line. And then the question is, what does that line look like? We'll figure that out in the spring. And then do they need to go back into the portal to bring in another lineman after the spring, or do they feel like they've got enough with what they've got on the roster? You mentioned Jacob James not playing this spring. He's the only offensive lineman not playing this spring. There were 7 other guys who are not going to be going this spring. Most of these are just minor precautionary, hold guys out to get them well after some postseason surgery, just like cleanup stuff. So even guys who were playing in that Peach Bowl game, Julian Fleming, Emeka Ibuka, Tommy Eichenberg, those 3 guys not going to be active this spring. Evan Pryor, Mitchell Melton, they both missed all of last year. They're going to be out this spring as well. Trevion Henderson and Court Williams, the other 2 who will not be there this spring. So that's 8 guys altogether who are not going to be. And there may be other guys who get added to that list, but so far those are the 8 guys who are not going to be part of the spring ball. And this was our first chance to talk to Jim Knowles and talk to the rest of the coaching staff as well since that Peach Bowl. And I think Jim Knowles, broadly speaking, that first year in Columbus was a pretty successful one. The defense was statistically a lot better in a lot of areas, but you had a couple games at the end of the season where they gave up some really big plays, especially towards the end of games, that ended up costing them. And, Ryan Day was asked about that, do you maybe need to revisit that a little bit? Were you a little bit was the defense maybe a little bit too aggressive in situations where they were protecting a lead? And it sounds like, yeah, he thinks maybe they do need to kind of take another look at some of that stuff.
Yeah, you can't be giving up big plays like that. I mean, is what it comes down to once you have something that's closer to being talent equated. Okay, whatever, you give up a couple of big plays against Akron, and it's not really going to matter at that point. You give up a couple of big plays against Michigan, we see what happens. You give up a couple of big plays against UGA, and we see what happens at that point. So there is going to be an evaluation of how some things are, and I had the opportunity to listen to a little bit of Jim Knowles as I was kind of spraying a lot of different interviews on Wednesday, and he said that he only had gone back and watched the Georgia film once, and to this point, and there were some positives about how they were able to make some adjustments in that third quarter, and then obviously there were some things that weren't as positive, including some of the big plays that gave up and some very aggressive calls. So I think that Ryan Day is more of the CEO type of head coach, if that's what comes out, can be more involved in keeping more of a focus on the defensive side. Even if you do have Jim Knowles as the head coach of your defense, you are still the head coach of the head coaches. So you have, at that point, I mean, everything's going to fall onto him. When things aren't going well, Ryan Day is hearing just as much as anybody. So, I mean, he's got to hold his guys accountable and try and rectify some of these issues. And I don't think we're going to hear much of, sometimes we're going to give up big plays, 5 or whatever. 5 I don't think is ever going to be mentioned again around the halls of the Woody. Let's try and cut it down to 2 or 1 or none.
Yeah, it does feel like there will be a little bit of a philosophical shift there. And some of that's just going to be based on new personnel, and you set your defense around what you've got in terms of personnel. And there's going to be a lot of new faces out there with a lot of guys off to the NFL. So we'll be tracking all of that. We'll be tracking all of those storylines throughout the spring and the summer and the fall, as well as all the other stuff that we didn't even get a chance to talk about there. This was kind of like a Cliff Notes version of the things we saw, the things we heard during those interviews on Wednesday. Again, if you want to get a little more in-depth on it, you can find the full hour-long recap that Tony Gerdeman and I did on the Buckeye Weekly podcast feed. And there's plenty of written content on it as well, including sort of point-by-point breakdowns of a whole bunch of those interviews on the Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That is a members-only portion of the site. That is where all of our great recruiting coverage lives, including the new daily recruiting feature, Eyes on the Trail, that Mark Givler and Alex Gleitman are writing every day. That's something we talked about on yesterday's show. It is a fantastic new feature, and it is not a rebranding of old content. This is in addition to the Skull Session piece that Mark does every week, the ADEC piece that Alex does every week. There is a ton of recruiting content there, lots of recruiting talk, transfer portal talk, all that kind of good stuff, all on the Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. So make sure you are signed up today. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.